Undeceptions podcast. When the facade over the great west door of London's Westminster Abbey was completed in the 15th century, its 10 statue niches remained empty. They were going to be filled with future heroes of the faith. Centuries later, 10 individuals who gave their lives for others and for the sake of Christianity in the 20th century were named the modern martyrs. Their statues now fill those Westminster Abbey niches, unveiled at a ceremony attended by Queen Elizabeth in 1998. Among them were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, Oscar Romero, an advocate for the poor, assassinated at the start of the Salvadorian Civil War, and the German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The story of how Bonhoeffer resisted the Nazis and became involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler in the Second World War is a well-known one. But his fame has ballooned into a kind of mythology that has seen people of all stripes claim him as their own. He's been used as a poster boy at both ends of the spectrum, and for any number of controversial, even contradictory, theological and political positions. Historian Victoria Barnett from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum reckons that popular hagiography has lifted Bonhoeffer far beyond the historical record. She goes on that we take his life and give it the meaning we would like it to have. The story of Bonhoeffer's life has taken on a life of its own. In 1993, pro-life advocate Paul Hill bombed an abortion clinic and cited Bonhoeffer's involvement in the plot to kill Hitler as justification. Bonhoeffer's name was invoked by President George W. Bush in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks, when he compared the fight against terrorism to Bonhoeffer's stand against Nazi rule. And just last year, Extinction Rebellion climate protesters invoked Bonhoeffer as justification for their civil disobedience. We now have the term Bonhoeffer moment, a crisis point where morally repugnant acts might be considered in order to head off even greater evil. The trouble is, it seems like almost anyone can have their Bonhoeffer moment, making Bonhoeffer's actions fit their own cause. A new movie released just last week may have added more fuel to this fire. Some Bonhoeffer experts have already expressed concern that the film exaggerates his role as assassin and is being used to promote a muscular Christian nationalism in the US. Now, I don't know if that's true. The criticism itself might be part of the culture war. I'm going to watch the film for myself and work it out. The point, though, is that there is a real person behind all this myth-making. And if we only think of him as hero for our cause, we're going to miss important pieces of his complex life and thinking. So, who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? And why does he still matter? I'm John Dixon, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic. Get discounts on master lectures, video courses, and exclusive samples of their books at zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. Don't forget to write Undeceptions. Each episode here at Undeceptions, we explore some aspect of life, faith, philosophy, history, science, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. And with the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out. What do we need to know about 1920s, 30s Germany, life in Germany, politics, religion, before we even introduce this extraordinary character of Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, so it's a really important period. It's a great question with which to start this whole story off. So what we have is Germany that is still reeling after having lost the First World War, but not just having lost the First World War.
That's Dr. Matthew Kirkpatrick, a lecturer in ethics and doctrine at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University. Matthew's PhD analysed the thought of Søren Kierkegaard and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's written 2 books specifically on Bonhoeffer, including one released just this year called Bonhoeffer for the Church. Link in the show notes.
The First World War. But not just having lost the First World War, they've also gone through the Treaty of Versailles, which has not only caused significant ramifications for them financially in terms of reparations, in terms of the reduction of their military, in terms of the massive loss of land, but also there's something called the guilt clause, where they've been forced to take responsibility for the entirety of the First World War. So they're also feeling shamed by the allies around them.
In the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost about 13% of its land and 10% of its population. And the loss of land meant that Germany lost half of its iron production and a large proportion of coal production. The German army was limited to just 100,000 soldiers, with a navy of just 15,000 sailors. The financial reparations were 132 billion gold marks. That's over 500 billion US dollars today. The final payment was only made in 2010, which is incredible.
They're also in a period of massive economic decline. The Great Depression is happening over in the States, and with huge implications for Europe as well. So they're in a massively low position. So what we get is the rise of National Socialism. Hitler appears on the scene at this most incredible moment. And he comes, most famously with his anti-Semitic message. But in some respects, National Socialism is built on a kind of romanticism. It's a message of hope, of restoration, of redemption, of fulfillment. The early images that we're finding of Nazi propaganda are really of young people standing in a field in their PE whites doing jumping jacks, sort of getting back to nature and the revitalization of the German spirit. And this is just an astonishing message for a people without hope. And so many people just lap this up.
One of Hitler's early confidants, Ernst Hanfstaengl, wrote that Hitler, quote, was not so much a distiller as a bartender of genius. He took all the ingredients the German tradition offered him and mixed them through his private alchemy into a cocktail they wanted to drink.
So if we're thinking about some of the philosophical, we've got people like Hegel. Hegel's philosophy is rooted in this idea of the progression of history until its fulfillment. Even though Hegel was German, his great heroes was Napoleon, because he saw in Napoleon this incredible person who was driving history forward into the unification of history, but also the unification of the nations. And so from those Hegelian ideas, I think National Socialism, Hitler gains this idea of Germany as being the nation that's going to do that. But we also find it with influence of people like Nietzsche and the idea of...
Yeah, you often hear that Nietzsche is in the background of some of Hitler's thought. This is true, it's not just a cliche?
Academics, true to form, will debate as to quite how significant these different characters are, but we're kind of talking about a milieu. We're talking about a whole context, all of it sort of weaving together this kind of tapestry. So Hitler has some pretty choice things to say about the Jews. He also has a very strong thing about going beyond good and evil, about giving up the ressentiment or the resentment of the slave classes to regain a nobility to ethics, which really...
That sounds like Nietzsche.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's pretty scary to read in many respects. But if you're the sort of person who reads that and goes, yes, that's me, I'm the Übermensch, I come from this class of nobility that really should be driving everything forward. We see that coming into the Nazi regime with its profound rejection of weakness. We often forget their treatment of the disabled, who were being dispatched much earlier than the final solution with the Holocaust and the Jews.
Yes, and of course Nietzsche, explicitly in something like The Antichrist, said that this is one of the problems with Christianity. It preserves what nature intended to remove.
Yeah, absolutely.
Christian compassion sort of preserves the disabled and the weak and so on. But nature wants to get rid of that to allow a revitalization of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's not a social Darwinianist per se, but it's very much those kind of ideas.
Can you describe what Christianity in Germany was like in this period?
Well, so the one further character to bring into this mix, actually, before we move on, is Luther. Yeah. Because unfortunately, Luther does play a certain role. Again, academics will debate as to how much role he plays in here. He has, again, some really anti-Semitic stuff rooted in his theology.
I apologise to any listeners with Jewish heritage, but here's an excerpt from Luther's 1543 tract, The Jews and Their Lies.
Therefore, dear Christian, be advised and do not doubt that next to the devil you have no more bitter, venomous and vehement foe than a real Jew who earnestly seeks to be a Jew. Therefore, the history books often accuse them of contaminating wells, of kidnapping and piercing children. They, of course, deny this. Whether it is true or not, I do know that they do not lack the complete, full and ready will to do such things.
Most of this booklet is a biblical argument for why Christ is the fulfillment of Old Testament Jewish hopes. But Luther ends with 7 shameful recommendations about the Jewish problem in Germany. Brace yourself.
First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct of the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, tradesmen, or the like. Let them stay at home. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow.
Shocking. Just shocking. We did 2 big episodes on Luther and the Reformation. That's episodes 91 and 92. And I asked my guest, Matthew Barrett, how to reconcile Luther's comments with the rest of his ministry. You'll find a link in the show notes. Our point is that almost 400 years afterwards, Luther's words were being weaponized. In 1933, Nazi education minister Bernhard Rust wrote, "I think the time is past when one may not say the names of Hitler and Luther in the same breath. They belong together. They are of the same old stamp." Lord have mercy.
Partly an answer also to what are the Christians doing this time. So at least one academic has claimed that one of the most dangerous people in Nazi Germany at the time is a guy called Paul Althaus, who's not a card-carrying Nazi, but he's a Lutheran scholar. He's one of the great Lutheran scholars of the 20th century. If you read his Ethics of Martin Luther, the final chapter is titled something like Great Men in History, because he sees rooted in Luther's ideas, the idea that God raises up particular people to bring about God's purposes on earth. And so when you sort of tie all those things together, you've got this perfect sort of microcosm for a weird philosophical, pseudo-spiritual ideology that really drives everything forward and can draw forward not just general people, but Christians.
The word Vergangenheitsbewältigung is not only a hard word to pronounce, it's also a hard concept to get your head around. It literally translates as past management. But the connotation is a moral one. It's about coming to terms with the guilt of history. And the church itself has some Vergangenheitsbewältigung to do. Holocaust historian Robert Erickson wrote,
Christians also did not want to face the Holocaust. Outside as well as inside Germany, They quite desperately wanted to think that real Christians would have recognised the immorality of the Nazi state, would have condemned the regime in their hearts, even if they did not possess the courage or the ability to stand up in opposition.
There's a whole episode to do on the Holocaust, and we can only touch on this now. But Erikson insists that Christians and other Germans found it easier to march behind Adolf Hitler than we might like to think. Yet, the German church was not unified on this point. There was the Catholic-Protestant distinction, of course. Within the Protestant tradition, the majority of Germany's 40 million Protestants in the 1930s were part of the German Evangelical Church. Evangelical, or evangelisch here, by the way, just means Protestant in German. It's not evangelical in the modern American sense. But even within this Protestant movement, there were splinter groups. In the 1920s, the Deutsche Christen, or German Christian movement, emerged from the broader Protestant group, embracing many of the nationalistic, even racial aspects of Nazi ideology. When the Nazis came to power, this German Christian movement pledged allegiance to Hitler and sought the creation of the Reich Church to support a Nazified version of Christianity, if you can believe that. As we'll hear from Matthew, another group was formed in opposition to these nationalists. They called themselves the Bekennende Kirche, the confessing church.
The caricature one often has is that, German Christians were all just nationalists. There wasn't really any heartfelt Christianity there. But what evidence do we have that they were real, red-hot, heartfelt Christians right in the middle of this mess?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of using the term Christian, I do so with a slight hesitancy in the sense that the theological landscape you've got here is pretty unusual. So you've got a nation which finds its root in Luther. So the Lutheran Church is enormous. It's not united. There are lots of different groups of Lutheran churches spread around the nation itself. But you also have this growth of something called Völkisch theology, which very much taps into the romanticism of what's happening in Europe as a whole. Romanticism is coming out of the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, and National Socialism is just an articulation of that kind of spirit. So in some respects, the Völkisch theology becomes problematic for Hitler because it goes almost too far down this strange ideological route. The kind of theology that really helped Hitler out was rooted in a more Lutheran perspective. And again, absolutely not saying this is what Lutheranism is, this is what Luther necessarily said, but this is how Luther theology was taken and implications came from it that Luther had no idea about, which in particular is to do with the relationship between church and state. Luther saw an absolute separation between the two. Church is in God's right hand, state is in God's left. Both of them are exercising God's love in a certain way, but the state is there to wield the sword of justice, and the church is there to proclaim the kingdom of God. The two are fundamentally separate, which creates the problem. Are
you saying Thomas Jefferson didn't invent that idea?
Thomas Jefferson did not invent that idea, I'm afraid to say. But what it does is it means that, the two entities are totally separate. So they're not, Luther is quite explicit that they're not meant to get involved in each other. The church is never meant to rule. The state is never meant to take over spiritual matters. Disaster will occur if that
Yet the
happens.
church will proclaim, it proclaims the righteousness of God.
Absolutely. But what it therefore means is that Hitler's able to come along and go, hey, churches, I'm not going to touch you. You go ahead and proclaim Jesus. But do not say anything about me because there's a separation. If you say anything about me and you start getting involved in politics, then you're the one that's breaking the rules, in which case I can now get involved. And the real tragedy about the church's response to National Socialism is that the one time they really got involved was when we have the creation of the Reichskirche, when we have elections being held in order to see who's going to become the Reichsbishop to take over. And then just before the election, Hitler goes on the radio address, does a radio address, and advocates for his candidate, this guy called Müller. At that point, he's broken the relationship between church and state, and the church gets all up in arms. And so in many respects, the great tragedy is one of the big times the church actually rebels. It's over a matter of church politics. And essentially, it's a matter of them fighting for their own kind of survival and their own purity, as opposed to all the stuff that's been going on around them.
Hitler got his guy, Ludwig Müller, installed as Reich Bishop in 1933. The nationalistic veins of Nazism were beginning to run deep in the German Christian movement. Have a listen to this from their 1934 pamphlet, The Cross of Christ and the Swastika.
The cross of Christ and the swastika do not need to oppose each other and must not do so, but rather they can and should stand together. One should not dominate the other, but rather each should maintain its own meaning and significance. The cross of Christ points toward heaven and admonishes us. Remember that you are Christian people, carried by the eternal love of the Heavenly Father, free through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, sanctified by the power of God's Spirit. The swastika, however, points to the world as a divine creation and admonishes us, remember that you are German, born in German territory to parents of German blood, filled with the German spirit and essence, formed according to German nature. Both together, however, the cross of Christ and the swastika admonish us. Remember that you are German Christian people and should become ever more whole German Christian people and remain so.
Then in 1937, the German Christian movement published its official statement.
The National Church Movement, German Christian, stands for an overcoming and eradication of all Jewish and foreign Völkisch spirit in church teaching and ways of life, and confesses German Christianity to be the racially appropriate religion of the German Volk. Christ is not the scion and fulfiller of Judaism, but rather its deadly enemy and conqueror. In the Nazi treatment of Jews and its ideological stance, Luther's intentions after centuries are being fulfilled.
This German Christian movement was not even close to the majority of Protestants in Germany, but its influence was disproportionately great. The confessing church movement emerged in opposition both to the German Christian movement and to Nazism itself. Among its leaders was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's time we meet him properly. After the break.
Okay, we should probably introduce the great man.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great spot in which to do it.
Tell us about the upbringing and education of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, okay. So Bonhoeffer is born at the very beginning of the 20th century. He grows up in a period very much defined by the First World War, by the Great Depression. He spends quite a bit of his time going around the black market, buying food for his family and things like this. He enters into theological education, becomes a Lutheran minister, and writes a whole range of different theological treatises which have become spiritual classics. So in a sense, that's some of the sort of facts that are there.
Was he known as brilliant when he was at theological school?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the stuff that he's writing is really of an incredible level, and he's quite stunning in many respects. So yeah, he's someone who's seen as having this brilliant career. And in many respects, he frustrates some people by his choices about his role within the church and his role within the university scene, which in a sense direct him away from a more glittering career in academia.
He wanted to be more pastor than...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. For him, a theologian is someone who is in the church. That is what theology is for. It's not for abstract academic purposes. And in fact, he warns theologians. He says, look, it'd be much, much better if most theologians went off and became brilliant lawyers, brilliant teachers and medics and what have you, than that they go into theology.
Okay, but he goes into theology.
He goes into theology, absolutely, because he sees this calling very much in the heart of his of what he's meant to do. So his family are actually broadly scientists who don't have a particular interest in the church. And in fact, they think it's this boring, irrelevant institution. And all it really does is affirm a kind of bourgeois status quo. And so they try and talk him out of going into it. But his response to it is, absolutely fine, I will therefore reform it. So at the very beginning, he's going in with a very clear vision of the church as being this really problematic entity, and in particular its role within society. It is seen as this thing which just is for bourgeois people, doesn't really care about the lower classes, and doesn't do anything in a certain way.
The church can only defend its own space by fighting, not for space, but for the salvation of the world. Otherwise, the church becomes a religious society that fights for its own interest and thus has ceased to be the Church of God in the world. So the first task given to those who belong to the Church of God is not to be something for themselves, for example, by creating a religious organization or leading a pious life, but to be witnesses of Jesus Christ to the world. Bonhoeffer, Ethics.
So he wasn't a household name.
Oh, by no means.
Right.
No.
Okay.
No. One of the things which is kind of crucial, sort of going back to the context of Germany at this time, because they've been treated so badly, because they've been shamed, Germany doesn't like anybody, quite understandably. But what Bonhoeffer does is he travels. This is very strange at this time. Well, he's got the money to travel, so his family is sort of upper middle class, so he's got the ability to do that. But most Germans don't want to do it because to step foot in France is to immediately step foot in enemy territory. But he goes on this astonishing European tour. So he goes and spends quite a bit of time at Easter in Rome and is amazed. These amazing stories of him sitting on a column, drinking young wine and eating cheese, looking at all of these Roman Catholic families going around the churches to all these Easter different celebrations. And that has a hugely transformative experience for his understanding of theology and the church and its importance within society generally. But he travels all over the place.
Bonhoeffer was captivated by the sights and sounds of Catholicism in Rome. The faith absorbed the whole city, something he didn't see in Germany. He wrote in his diary that the whole experience opened his eyes to the universality of faith.
But he travels all over the place, and including, as you mentioned, he heads over to New York. So he goes on a sabbatical or a semester abroad to study over at Union Theological Seminary. So he steps off the boat into Great Depression, New York. So he's suddenly confronted by this kind of environment. He's confronted by a nation in the full swing of segregation. He's someone who spends a lot of his time reading about the lynchings that are going on in America. He travels around America, goes into the Jim Crow South, heads on down to Cuba and various...
And are people welcoming him as the great international theologian at that point?
Oh, no.
Or is this just his own... He's like a backpacker.
Oh, yeah, basically. Yeah, absolutely. He's still a young student at this point. But what's striking about his time there is he spends an awful lot of time in Harlem.
Yes.
At the First Abyssinian Church in Harlem, yeah. So under the teaching of Adam Clayton Powell Sr., one of the great liberational preachers at that time.
Adam Clayton Powell Sr. developed the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. It was one of the largest, predominantly African-American congregations in the country at the time.
And to give something of his character, so I don't know if your listeners will ever get to see a picture of Bonhoeffer.
We'll put it in the show notes and so on. Yeah.
You couldn't sort of see a whiter guy in some respects.
Yeah, he's pretty white.
In style, in look, in pretty much everything. But he ends up in this black church at the center of the Harlem Renaissance. So he's reading a huge amount of Du Bois and various others. And he just ingratiates himself into this community. He immediately starts taking over things like the Sunday school, helping out the Sunday school. He's leading women's Bible study. But his heart, his openness, his ability to come into a scenario that is utterly foreign to him and yet to win people over with the bigness of his heart and the bigness of his mind. Not a mind that projects and tells people what to think, but just this desire for openness and to learn just wins people over in the most astonishing ways. So he also goes to Howard University, spends a bit of time there, gets to know it a little bit.
That's a historically black university.
So that's the historically black university in New York. And so what he's doing over this time is getting this international perspective. So when he returns back to Germany, he can immediately see things, and because of his family background, he sees things that other people just can't see, who are insular, who have got lost in their own way of thinking. So that with that background from New York, when he comes back into early 1930s Germany, the anti-Semitism, the segregation that's starting to happen, he sees it immediately. And so he then spends the next however many years trying to tell people about it.
While Bonhoeffer was in America, the Nazi Party back home was gaining ground. A year into the Great Depression, Hitler and the Nazis played on people's anxieties and offered up the Jews and the communists as scapegoats. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Bonhoeffer began to speak out.
Throughout these sort of middle 1930s, he's trying to get people to pay attention. But everybody thinks he's just this great, really pessimistic character. So he does a lot of work within the ecumenical world. So ecumenism is to do with bringing the churches together from different denominations and what have you. And in some of his speeches to this ecumenical movement in the early 30s, he's talking about the possibility of war again. And some of these speeches are before Hitler's even gained power again. And so for them, they're kind of, what are you even talking about? Why? Of course we won't have war again. That's kind of nuts. But Bonhoeffer, for instance, has spent time in New York. He writes this really fascinating treatise on young black men because he sees this undercurrent, particularly within the youth, of anger, of resentment, of the sort of liberation that the older generation seemed to have claimed, but yet actually wasn't liberation at all. And in actual fact, this older generation have really just sort of lied to them. And they're the reason for the plight of these young people. And so it's not just race relations that's the problem, that helping them see the what's going on in terms of segregation and anti-Semitism. He also can perceive this tremor that's happening underneath, and in particular with young people. So he, throughout his life, he's always, whenever he goes to church, he takes over the Sunday school. So here's this great theologian, one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He spends huge amounts of time with children and has this astonishing ability to reach them. He also works with students at the university, both academically and pastorally. And what does he see? The Hitler Youth Movement.
Yeah.
Just taking them.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who are giving them hope. So when he's talking about sort of the Führer principle in the younger generation, he's seeing, of course, they're going to give in to the Führer because there's no alternative. Where else is hope? Where else is this romanticism that actually says there is redemption to this situation?
Things are coming to a crisis more horribly than ever before. Millions of starving people whose wishes have been put off or unfulfilled. Desperate people who have nothing to love but their lives and who with their lives lose nothing. Humiliated and degraded nations who are not able to recover their dishonor. Political extremes against political extremes. Fanaticized against fanaticized. False gods against false gods. And behind all this, a world bristling with weapons as never before. A world that is feverishly mobilizing for war in order to guarantee peace through armaments. A world whose false gods have become the word security, sécurité. A world without sacrifice, full of distrust and suspicion, because it still feels the terrors of the past in its bones. A humanity that trembles before its very self. A humanity that is not sure of itself, and that is ready at any time to do violence unto itself. How can one close one's eyes here to the fact that the demons themselves have taken control of the world? That it is the forces of darkness that here gruesomely conspire and can burst forth at any moment? How can one think that, with a little bit of education toward international understanding and a bit of goodwill, these demons can be exorcised, these forces can be banished? Bonhoeffer, Ecumenical Academic and Pastoral Work, 1932.
So Bonhoeffer is on the radar of the Nazis pretty early on, but he's not on the top 10 wanted list or anything like that. His main target is to get the church to start to pay attention. So he's one of the founding members of what was called the Pastors Emergency League and then the Confessing Church, which then becomes this sort of rebel church, standing against the Reichskirche and the idea of this intermingling of state and church in a certain way, sort of nationalized.
Are they an actual denomination, or are they really just a collective of Lutheran churches who see themselves as they're an alliance?
Yeah, it's an alliance, yeah, absolutely. So Bonhoeffer's not in charge of it. The person in charge of it is Martin Niemöller, who used to be a U-boat captain in the First World War, but then turned to the church.
Here we are back in 1934. The German Christian movement has become the Reich Church, advocating a Nazified Christianity. And now we have the Confessing Church as well, which declared that the church's allegiance was to God and Scripture, not a worldly Führer. There were around 17,000 Protestant pastors in Germany in this period. Some estimates have about 7,000 of those pastors, or 40%, joining the Confessing Church that opposed Hitler. About another 5,000, or 30%, as part of the German Christian movement, which supported Hitler. And the final 5,000 remained uncommitted neutrals. But it's more complicated still.
But even with the Confessing Church, in Bonhoeffer's mind, they're really only interested in their own survival. They're only interested, again, in this question of church purity. But the church is meant to be the church. It mustn't get confused by the state or sort of influenced by the state in a certain way. Whereas Bonhoeffer, throughout this period, and especially at the end, is putting forward this message that the church has simply fought for itself and is uninterested in the people around it. It is blind to their suffering. And what's so ironically tragic for Bonhoeffer is the quickest way to kill the church is for it to try and save itself. Because if the church is meant to be the body of Christ, then the one thing Christ did not try to do was to save himself. It was the very opposite. He died for the sake of other people. And so, in a sense, that's part of the later story as where Bonhoeffer sees the church ultimately finding itself. But he's, in this period, trying to get the church to do anything to stand up against the Nazi regime.
Are they listening?
No, not at all. So Martin Niemöller even sends, so when Hitler storms out of the League of Nations, Martin Niemöller sends a telegram of congratulations on behalf of the Confessing Church. Because everybody still wants to be a patriot. So what you really don't want to be at that time is someone who comes across as unpatriotic. Yeah. So even if you're fighting for the church, you still want to seem German and, the stuff that seems good that Hitler's doing, well, we really want to congratulate him for him, just to make sure that becomes clear.
In April 1933, Hitler passed the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, which included as its third clause the Aryan paragraph, ordering that Jews were no longer allowed to work for the civil service. Soon after, another law and another Aryan paragraph limited the number of Jewish students allowed in German schools, and then another banned Jews from owning or running farms. It was only a matter of time before an Aryan paragraph reached the church. Once the Reich Church was established, it didn't take long for the Reich Bishop to hand over the Protestant youth groups to the Hitler Youth and to enact the Aryan paragraph within the church. All Jewish descent clergy were dismissed from service. Bonhoeffer wrote to his friend, the German theologian Karl Barth, "Wherever the church introduces the Aryan paragraph, it ceases to be the Christian church."
So we're in sort of 1935, 1936 kind of territory. In a sense, I'm painting kind of a pretty negative picture of the Confessing Church. There are some very faithful people in there who are also trying to get the church to take things seriously. But and it's also true the Confessing Church is illegal because it's not part of the Reichskirche. And so they asked Bonhoeffer to take over this seminary to train up illegally Confessing Church priests who would then go out and continue to minister in the country. And so that's what Bonhoeffer does. It only lasts for maybe like a year and a half before the Gestapo shut it down. It's hidden deep in the forest somewhere. It gets shut down. And slowly but surely, sort of Bonhoeffer becomes more and more on the radar of the Nazis. And so that with growing steps, he's stopped from being allowed to speak in public. He stopped from being allowed to publish. He stopped from being allowed to enter Berlin. And slowly but surely, they clip his wings. And it's at this point that, in Bonhoeffer's mind, the church has kind of failed, because he's kind of exhausted all possible avenues that he can go down. And yet the church has not done anything, and possibly worse than that, by fighting for its own survival, really rejected its identity in a certain sense. But the church finds no unified vision. It finds no real foundation upon which to actually stand up against the Nazi regime. So that even by 1938, 1939, 85% of all confessing church pastors have sworn an oath to Hitler on his birthday.
In June 1939, just months before the German invasion of Poland that kicked off World War II, Bonhoeffer accepted an invitation to lecture back in America. He soon regretted the decision to leave Germany. He wrote,
"I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security."
Returning to Germany meant risking conscription, which Bonhoeffer could never countenance. Then he gets an interesting offer.
And it's at this point that he then makes the big movement of his life, which is to join the German resistance, which is based within the Abwehr, the military intelligence of the Nazi regime.
Just pause there. How amazing is that? The resistance to the Nazi regime is secretly based within the Defense Department, within intelligence itself. And Bonhoeffer, a brilliant theologian, is invited to join them.
I mean, he in a way, like, his family and friends are in that upper echelon anyway.
Yeah.
Is it through friends of friends that he gets connected with them?
Yeah, so Hans von Dohnanyi is his brother-in-law. He's one of the central people within the Abwehr, military intelligence. So the other two are General Oster and General Canaris. And it seems very weird for the one of the centers of the German resistance to be within the Nazi regime itself. But the way Hitler had set up the Nazi regime is kind of with a Roman model, which is where you kind of have these competing departments. And in a sense, if they can be vying for power with each other, then it sort of stops them from trying to take power from the top in a certain way. So for instance, the Abwehr and the Gestapo hated each other. And that was a tension that Hitler was probably very happy to have forged. So it's not, in some respects, surprising that you would have this group who would, at a certain point, actually desire to take out the top.
Hans Oster and Wilhelm Canaris were leading figures in the German resistance. Canaris was the chief of the Abwehr, the equivalent to director of MI5 or CIA. Oster was the deputy head of counter-espionage. I'd never heard of Hans von Dohnanyi, Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, but he was the one who drew Bonhoeffer into the resistance. Von Dohnanyi recorded Nazi crimes, helped victims, and tried to sabotage Nazi policies. Canaris, Oster, and von Dohnanyi were making plans for a coup to oust Hitler. They invited Bonhoeffer to join them.
So what does he start to do? What does Bonhoeffer start to do?
So Bonhoeffer becomes a double agent, basically. So he is employed by the Abwehr on the surface in order to use his ecumenical ties. So we mentioned that he was a part of this ecumenical movement, conferences all around the world with denominations from around the world. So the Abwehr send Bonhoeffer to various different nations like UK, Sweden, Switzerland, elsewhere, in order to say how good Germany is and how actually everything's going very well, thanks very much. But what he's actually doing is using his ecumenical connections to get a message across to the Allies, which is that there is a German resistance. It is trying to take out Hitler and to put a new government in place. Consequently, when it does that, it wants to restart diplomatic relationships. So in some respects, the story of this kind of resistance is extremely complicated. So you imagine you're the Abwehr. You feel like we need to take out Hitler, and we don't want, once we do that, suddenly the Allied nations, the Germans, the Americans and the British, to suddenly march into Berlin and take over. So you want to put in a new government. But you've got to start approaching people. I mean, this isn't the sort of stuff you sort of just mention over a drink at a dinner party kind of thing. Would you mind stepping into a government once we've taken Hitler out? No, it's hugely complicated and so risky to try and even sound out people to do this. So when they do, the obvious response is, well, hang on a moment. I don't want to start up in this new government if the Allies do then march on us and then hold me responsible for everything that's been going on, because they're going to take hold of whoever's at the top. So they say, well, okay, I will do this if you can get an assurance from the Allies that they will respect what happens and there'll be a cessation of war and we'll be able to start these diplomatic relations. So Bonhoeffer's job is crucial in terms of getting messages back to the Allies to say, look, can we get an assurance from you that you won't suddenly take out the government, this new government we're putting in place, because we need that.
I mean, is this early in the war? Or
this is pretty early.
Are we talking 39, 40?
Yeah, that kind of territory. And I don't know when. So Bonhoeffer comes in, but in terms of when those first conversations were starting, it was starting up before Bonhoeffer arrived. But Bonhoeffer becomes this really crucial role in getting this message out there. So in particular, Bishop George Bell is one of his great connections, who's getting messages back to Churchill. Unfortunately, Churchill had already said he wouldn't listen. He'd already made that decision, and that he wouldn't believe any stories coming out of Germany. So there's a sort of tragic element to this whole thing. But the resistance goes ahead nonetheless.
After the break, the plots on Hitler and Bonhoeffer's moral and theological wrestling with it all.
State security is trying to overthrow Hitler. How would High Command respond?
We would have no choice. We would declare a military state of emergency.
Exactly, and initiate Valkyrie.
Hitler's own reserve army, using Hitler's own plan, will have no choice but to seize power in Berlin to prevent the SS takeover. They'll think they're fighting for Hitler's government, not against it.
While we quietly put a new government in place.
But only if he's dead. That's what you're saying, isn't it? How else are you going to convince people the SS are trying to seize power?
We have to kill Hitler.
I'm disappointed in you, Colonel.
That's a clip from the 2008 blockbuster film Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise as Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, one of the key players in the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler. It's a tense, action-filled movie, even though we knew the ending before it started. It's really worth a watch if you can just push past the inexplicable American and British accents in the mouths of those playing German officers. Anyway, the film highlights the activities and pervasiveness of the German resistance. There were more than 20 plots to kill Hitler. The July 20 plot was the last one, and it, like the others, failed. Tom Cruise's character is portrayed in the film as the resistance's replacement for General Oster, whom Bonhoeffer had worked with at the Abwehr. Oster was dismissed from his post and placed under house arrest by the Nazis in 1943, at the same time as Bonhoeffer was arrested and imprisoned. Oster would eventually be taken to Flossenburg concentration camp with Bonhoeffer. They were executed together on the same day. Bonhoeffer himself doesn't appear as a character in the film Valkyrie. His real-life involvement in plots to kill Hitler have proven really controversial. Some popular accounts suggested he played a more central role in the German resistance than was actually the case, according to historical evidence. On the other hand, the movie Bonhoeffer, released this week, carries the subtitle Pastor, Spy, Assassin. The marketing has an image of Bonhoeffer holding a gun. So what do we actually know?
What is the truth of Bonhoeffer's involvement in an attempt to assassinate Hitler?
What is the truth?
Or how much do we know? Might be a better... How much do we know?
Again, it depends who you ask. So there's been some scholarship which has come out quite recently which wants to see Bonhoeffer within a much more pacifist perspective. And certainly at various different points in the 1930s, we do find very strong emphasis on that. If you read Discipleship, there does seem to be a very strong emphasis on peacemaking and a pacifist perspective. So some people think that Bonhoeffer didn't know actually what was happening, and that he didn't know that he can't be held responsible for what was happening in the assassination attempt.
Yeah, so he's definitely in this resistance movement.
Yeah.
But he is not necessarily, is that what you're saying, involved in a specific plot?
Well, so I put that out there just to lay out the landscape, because it is important that there are some people that see he didn't know, and for them, coming from a more pacifist perspective, it is hard to see a great theologian, a Christian, getting blood on their hands. My own mind is that Bonhoeffer did know he was getting blood on his hands, and his ethical theory provides the foundations for trying to understand how he's able to justify that.
And you brought me exactly to the question I was about to ask.
Right.
His ethical theory.
His ethical theory, yeah.
Brace yourself, friends. This is about to get pretty deep and unsettling. I still don't know what I think of it all.
Okay, so one of the most crucial things that Bonhoeffer wants to get across is that God is alive and that he is present, and that to be a Christian means to have a living relationship with that God. So when we're thinking about ethics, we often think about ethical rules. You know, Old Testament, 10 Commandments, fantastic. Okay. 10 Commandments did two things. One, it united the Israelites to God by keeping them obedient to him. But it also created a point of separation, because if an Israelite wanted to know what God wanted them to do, they go to the tablet rather than to God. And so one of the dangers of ethical rules is they become this barrier to us actually having a relationship with God. And so for Bonhoeffer, what's crucially important is that in every moment, we go to God actually to ask him, what do you want me to do? One of the great problems he sees in Christianity is that we created these big systems that work for us. We've created Christianity to be a religion that provides us with this nice structure to help us know what we're meant to do, how to be good, so that we feel secure and happy in ourselves, that actually we're all okay. Whereas for Bonhoeffer, that's a fabricated system that again stands in the way of our relationship with God. And so one of the things he sees as the great dangers of Christianity is that even if we start out in faith, even if we start out by going to God, very quickly we fall back into this other kind of religious Christianity, where even, well, this is who I know God to be, therefore God would want me to act in this kind of way. We kind of almost assume what God wants us to do. Whereas throughout Bonhoeffer's theology, we find this sense in which, no, you have to go back to God in each moment to actually seek out his will. Now, this isn't a kind of, just sit there and wait for the bolt from the blue, some big booming voice from above to then tell you what to do. But it's this commitment to God in each moment, to be listening to him. So to bring this all around, for Bonhoeffer, ethical rules are important, but they are only human articulations of God's will, which is much, much bigger than any human articulation, either in terms of our human conception or even in terms of our human language could possibly contain. So maybe 99.9% of the time, those ethical rules are going to work great, but not in every single situation. And he has this essay called Ethics as Formation, where he talks about how if you stick to ethics, if you become an ethicist, and I'm speaking about this as an ethicist here in Oxford. If you become an ethicist, you will be confused by situations that burst ethics in a certain sense, where instead of trying to figure out what's the right and the wrong, you might simply be confronted by two wrong possibilities, and you have to decide between them. And for Bonhoeffer, that was the situation in Nazi Germany.
Treating truthfulness as a principle leads to the grotesque conclusion that if asked by a murderer whether my friend, whom he was pursuing, had sought refuge in my house, I would have to answer honestly in the affirmative. Here, the self-righteousness of conscience has escalated into blasphemous recklessness and become an impediment to responsible action. I come into conflict with my responsibility when I refuse to become guilty of violating the principle of truthfulness for the sake of my friend. Refusing in this case to lie energetically for the sake of my friend. Refusing, in other words, to take on and bear guilt out of love for my neighbor. Responsible action takes place in the sphere of relativity, completely shrouded in the twilight that the historical situation casts upon good and evil. It takes place in the midst of the countless perspectives from which every phenomenon is seen. Responsible action must decide not simply between right and wrong, good and evil, but between right and right, wrong and wrong. Those who act out of free responsibility are justified by others by dire necessity. Before themselves they are acquitted by their conscience, but before God they hope only for grace. Bonhoeffer, Ethics.
And so for him, there are times when to tell the truth will work against the truth.
Yes, I had this quote.
Go for it.
There will be times when lying preserves the truth better than sticking to the facts.
Brilliant, fantastic.
When killing preserves life better than keeping our hands clean.
And at a certain point, you've got to keep listening to God to be able to hear that. And for him, that's what he heard. That at this point, enough is enough. Yeah. What God needs me to do is this.
Spoke in the wheel.
Put a spoke in the wheel to bring it to a grinding halt.
Yeah.
Now, what's really important, though, is that it doesn't change the ethics. What Bonhoeffer did was murder. And that's what he would have seen, because an ethical system will describe it as murder. It doesn't trivialize what he did by thinking, oh, God wants me to do it. It still has this profound anxiety in relation to it and thinking, this is actually what's happening. I'm going to commit murder according to these ethical systems. But it's just that that's what has to happen.
The question here is whether within the field of Christian ethics, any assertions may be made with regard to worldly institutions and conditions, e.g. the state, economics, or science, i.e., whether Christian ethics has an interest in worldly institutions and conditions, or whether these things fall within the zone of the demands of ethical imperatives. In other words, is it the Church's sole task to practice love and charity within the given worldly institutions, i.e., to inspire these institutions so far as possible with a new outlook, to mitigate hardships, to care for the victims of these institutions, and to establish a new order of her own within the congregation? Or is the Church charged with a mission towards the given worldly orders themselves? A mission of correction, improvement, etc., a mission to work towards a new worldly order? Has the Church merely to gather up those whom the wheel has crushed? Or has she to prevent the wheel from crushing them? Bonhoeffer, Ethics.
The Abwehr weren't initially arrested from the point of view of the idea that they'd been involved in an assassination attempt. So the initial reason for the arrest was charges of money laundering from within the Abwehr. So the Gestapo are looking for any possible reason to get their hands on the Abwehr and take it over. And so they're just looking for reasons. So something happened in Munich that they thought this would be an opportunity to do that. And so in actual fact, when Bonhoeffer is put in prison, when he's being investigated, it's not on the charges of you were going to these foreign nations in order to spy for the Abwehr and to send this message over. He thinks at a certain point he's going to get out because the interrogation isn't going very well, because there's not really much to it. But slowly but surely the Gestapo figure out that something else is going on, and that they keep on digging. They basically rip the offices of the Abwehr apart until they find this file. Because
after the July 20 plot, the Gestapo went on a rampage to find anyone involved in the resistance. Some historians estimate as many as 6,000 people were rounded up, tried, and most of them executed after the July 20 plot failed. On September 22nd, the Gestapo found secret files that Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans, had collected. The documents implicated Hans, Bonhoeffer, and many others.
Because the problem is, for the resistance, as we've just described it, the whole basis of this, the ability to get this resistance and this going, is in order to be able to have a paper trail to say who are the kind of goodies and the baddies in this kind of situation. So they have to keep that paper trail. Yeah. You know, we haven't got sort of encrypted disks or anything like that. It has to be a paper file, and it was hidden in the walls, I think, in the Abwehr, and it was finally found. And it's at that point that everything is over. The game is up because it contains everything. So at a certain point, Bonhoeffer thought he was going to get out. The assassinated attempts still go ahead. Many years in prison that they have failed. But at a certain point, yeah, the game is up. And even though the game was up for Hitler and he knew that he had lost, he made particularly sure that all those who'd been his particular enemies and those who had particularly tried to get rid of him were murdered before he killed himself. And so Bonhoeffer, along with all the other resistors, were murdered brutally just a couple of weeks before the end of the war.
Just weeks before the end of the European conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some stories of this very dignified death of Bonhoeffer sort of preaching his final sermon and then walking out to the gallows. Unfortunately, that's not the death of someone who tried to kill Hitler. And so a far more brutal one awaited him. That story particularly comes out from one of the medical examiners who checked the bodies to make sure that they were dead. And I think the sense is that story was created to help the medical examiner out and make them sound not so...
So what is the truth?
Well, I think the idea was that the members of the resistance were hung with a piano wire from a hook in the ceiling. I think that's the thought to be what happened to Bonhoeffer, because that's what happened to other people as part of the resistance. It doesn't end well, but in a sense it does end well because, I mean, who knows what Bonhoeffer's life would have become had he lived, but his legacy has just been so stunning in terms of impacting the 20th and 21st century. And we can maybe come on to what that was, but Bonhoeffer's life was utterly exhausting. One thing which is interesting about reading his theology is he's always writing into a particular context. He's never able, like nice academics such as myself, to sit in an office and sit down and just write something systematically. Yeah. No, he's constantly writing into a situation. But when he's in prison, he suddenly has to stop. His entire life stops. And he is now kept in the cell. He has some books he can get hold of. He has some writing implements. He has some things which are coming from his family which keep him going. But ultimately, all he can do is pray, think, write.
Do you mind sort of telling me one or two myths about Bonhoeffer? I mean, loads of people have written about Bonhoeffer, and he can be made into pretty much anything you like.
He can be made into pretty much anything.
So what do you reckon? What are the myths about Bonhoeffer that annoy you most?
Well, that's a very interesting question.
You don't have to name names, my friend. Just but ideas.
So I think the thing that annoys me most, and in a sense I'm being slightly diplomatic, but actually does get to the heart of what annoys me, is when Bonhoeffer gets co-opted into a very particular kind of way of thinking, into a particular religious perspective, or into a particular political perspective, or something along those lines. Because what's so crucial about understanding Bonhoeffer's theology is, just as we started off with our talking about his family, someone who was educated to stand on his own. He was Lutheran, had a huge central focus on the Word of God, and that's especially found in the Bible. But he has no interest in towing anybody party line. He's no interest in just affirming any particular person's theology. And in particular, with such a profound understanding of psychology, of so much of his work written on the concept of sin, and the way in which we try and take hold of religion, Christ, his words, and make them into something that makes us feel better about ourselves. His work is as much a critique of evangelicals as it is of liberals and everything in between.
Well, I think this is what I was sort of trying to draw out of you, that you can make him sound like a lefty, you can make him sound like a right-wing conservative. I'm just trying to get a sense of, where you feel discomfort with that.
Yeah, so I think I feel discomfort on all sides. Yeah. So if we're looking in the American context, for any particular American listeners, but I think America is a great test case in many respects. in terms of seeing the right or the left. I think Bonhoeffer has profound words to speak against both of them. When he was in New York, he saw the social gospel. He saw preachers proclaiming freedom as an end in itself. Just an idea which is utterly absurd to Bonhoeffer. And yet he also has things to say about religious nationalism. Yeah. Again, in this specific context of America. And so I think if anybody is reading Bonhoeffer and not being convicted by him, then they're not really reading Bonhoeffer correctly. And that message is true not just for America. So one of the most important things he wrote was in a speech in 1932 to an ecumenical conference at a conference in Gland in Switzerland, banks of Lake Geneva. Bonhoeffer says, hasn't it become so crucially obvious to us that we no longer read the Bible correctly? Because we're far too interested in reading the Bible for ourselves rather than reading the Bible against ourselves. And that's what we do. When we go to churches that look like us. We hear people preaching in a way or read books where they're affirming the message that we believe to be true. And so we find security in numbers, that this is us and we know the truth as opposed to them over there. We're able to pat each other on the back. Isn't it great that we know that truth? We find it weird, for instance, if we go to church and someone sitting next to us believes something slightly different because we don't know why they're there. Isn't there another church you should be going to or something along those lines? Because we're actually only interested in a gospel, or primarily interested in a gospel that really speaks to us. Whereas for Bonhoeffer, we want to know the truth. If we really want to get closer and closer to God, then we need to listen to those that are going to show how our gospel is wrong. Because if it just keeps on showing us to be right, we're not moving anywhere. That doesn't mean to say we simply accept what other people say. It doesn't mean to say we simply think that they're right. But it means that we enter into those relationships with a hopefulness that God is speaking through those people to us. And so we should always be trying to read the Bible against ourselves. So many of us it's a matter of
looking for affirmation, looking for daily comfort today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another thing Bonhoeffer says, when he's talking about preaching, he gets really annoyed with preachers who try and make the Bible relevant, who tell funny stories or try and say, well, what the Bible's really saying is this, and this is how we apply it. He says that the Bible doesn't need your help.
Yeah.
Most importantly, because what it's talking about, it's appealing to that which is universal about us, not to that which is particular about us.
Yeah.
The particularities are just the circumstantial veneer of what's actually going on, which is that we are people who have fallen, all of us in exactly the same way. And so to focus on the veneer is, in a sense, a kind of obfuscation.
Yes.
It's kind
so
of
the eternal relevance of the Bible is that it's not trying to be relevant to our moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why Bonhoeffer can attack evangelicals, liberals, right-wing, left-wing at the same time, because they're all doing the same thing.
I want you to comment on this. If we were ever in a Bonhoeffer moment or season, we are in it right now in these next 42 days.
That's American pastor and cable television presenter Gene Bailey, naming just last month a Bonhoeffer moment in the lead up to the US elections. Well, we just heard Matthew Kirkpatrick tell us there really shouldn't be such a thing as a Bonhoeffer moment. There was only one Bonhoeffer moment, his actual historical moment, and that's gone. We shouldn't be turning him into a parable for our own moments, as a justification for our own extreme action. But that doesn't mean we can't learn anything from Bonhoeffer. Fundamentally, the idea of a Bonhoeffer moment asks the wrong question. We shouldn't be asking, what would Bonhoeffer do? I don't think he would have liked that question at all. For Bonhoeffer, the central, driving question was, who is Christ for us today? That's something we could maybe ask. For Bonhoeffer, knowing Jesus Christ was a lived reality. In his book called Ethics, he said, with every new day, therefore, the question arises, how, today, here, in this situation, can I remain and be preserved within this new life with God, with Jesus Christ? Bonhoeffer's call is not really to ask ourselves, who are the Nazis for us today, and am I standing up against them? No, the real Bonhoeffer question is, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And the fact is, we just can't make Jesus fit. He's not left or right. In politics, the left often claims Jesus as their own. He was pro-social responsibility, anti-capitalist, and so on. Those on the right tend to pin him up as pro-individual responsibility. He was all for sexual purity, and the list goes on. But Jesus is just himself. He's not left. He's not right. Both of those are Christian heresies, the splitting apart of something Jesus held together. Jesus isn't here to approve of me or you. And like Matthew says, and Bonhoeffer before him, if you find a Jesus that confirms just what you already think, he's probably an invention. We know Jesus through his word in the Bible. Bonhoeffer's warning is just as relevant to us today as it was in the 1930s. He wrote, "We prefer our own thoughts to those of the Bible. We no longer read the Bible seriously. We read it no longer against ourselves, but only for ourselves." Just as we mustn't co-opt Bonhoeffer and mould his thinking to justify our action today, we mustn't co-opt Jesus and make him into something that he's not. We are fooling ourselves if we do. Bonhoeffer constantly asked the question, who is Christ for us today? While in prison, he wrote a note for a book he was working on. That note would be discovered after his death, and it offers the most succinct answer to his lifelong question. The answer he wrote down was, Jesus is the man for others. Jesus became fully human. He lived as a human, died a terrible death, all for others, for the sake of humanity. He existed here for us, and Bonhoeffer calls the church to follow him. I quote again, "The church is only the church when it exists for others. The church must share in the secular problems of ordinary human life, not dominating, but helping and serving. It must tell men of every calling what it means to live in Christ, to exist for others." That's a message Bonhoeffer couldn't make the church of his day listen to, at least not all of the church. Jesus as the man for others is not so easily employed for our own causes. Bonhoeffer stood there bearing witness to a church that had lost sight of Jesus. But Jesus, the man for others, is one they needed, and we still need it today. I hope you liked today's episode. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or a comment on Spotify. Give us some algorithmic love, won't you? Head to undeceptions.com and leave us a question. You can do it by text, but don't be boring. Leave us a voice record. We love your voice questions. And producer Kaylee may select you for our next Q&A episode. As always, you'll find a full transcript of the episode on our website, as well as the amazing show notes produced by Researcher Al. They're way too long to include in the teeny notes section of your podcast app. So head to the website for all the good stuff. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dixon, produced by Kaylee Payne, and directed by Mark Vergangenheitsbewältigung Hadley. Alistair Belling is our writer-researcher. Siobhan McGuinness, our online librarian. Lindy Leveson remains my wonderful assistant. Santino DeMarco is Chief Finance and Operations Consultant, editing by Richard Humley. Our voice actors today are Yannick, Laurie, and Dakota Love. Special thanks to our series sponsor, Zondervan, for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.